Welcome in, everyone. You are listening to the Authority Podcast here on the B Podcast Network. Thanks, as always, for being with us. Really excited to bring you a conversation today about pop culture literacies. My guest is Mia Hood. Across 2 decades in education, Mia has served in a variety of K-12 roles, including classroom teacher, instructional dean, and most recently, regional director of literacy. Currently, she designs curriculum for schools and nonprofits and teaches literacy in secondary education at the City University of New York and professional writing at New York University. Mia received her doctorate in curriculum and teaching from Teachers College at Columbia University, where she studied sociocultural and critical perspectives on literacy. She writes all about pop cultural literacies in the newsletter Pop Stack. Her book is called Pop Culture Literacies, Teaching Interpretation, Response, and Composition in the Digital World. Mia, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Delighted to be here.
I wanted to start out with your definition of what is pop culture today. Is there pop culture anymore? What does it look like when you're writing about that term? I guess, what is it referring to?
Yeah. Well, one of the major themes of my work is that distinctions and definitions that used to feel hard and fast are no longer relevant. There's this sort of encroaching sameness of all content and culture that we consume. But I take a very broad definition of pop culture texts and pop culture literacies. I think a pop culture text is anything that is kind of widely available to consume. We no longer live in a monoculture like we used to, where there was a small set of movie studios, a small set of television stations, a small set of popular music that everybody was consuming. Now, obviously, we're all in algorithmically shaped little niches online and we're consuming lots of different kinds of content. But I consider something a pop culture text or pop culture object if it's something that at least is available or accessible to a mass audience. And the vast majority of pop culture texts, even traditional kinds like films or songs, are now so filtered through social media and have been broken up into these little fragments and contentified. And so I still define those types of texts as being part of pop culture, even though we're now engaging with them in these different in these different forms.
What separates pop culture literacy from media literacy? Well, I mean, what makes them similar? I'm sure there's a lot of overlap, but what's
Yeah.
the delineation?
Yeah. Continuing on the theme that old distinctions no longer feel super
Yeah.
relevant. I think of pop culture literacy as a subset of media literacy. So I would say, in terms of media literacy, I think historically where media literacy has been most powerful and had the biggest impact is in its emphasis on democratic ideals, on the idea that, we need a citizenry that are going to be critical consumers of news
Mm.
media, of advertising, that they're going to be able to detect bias and distinguish information, misinformation, disinformation. So media literacy, of course, is more than that, but that has, I think, been its historical emphasis. And those are the sort of ideals that it's been rooted in. For me, pop culture, how I've studied it and how I've researched it, it comes from more of a lineage of scholarship from cultural studies. And in that field, it's more about taking some of the tools and habits of mind and values of how we study literature
Mhm.
and how we study fine art and applying those same tools to pop culture texts. So it's looking
Mhm.
at a film in much the same way we might look at a novel, for example. So pop culture literacy, I would say, has been historically, and for me, is a little bit more focused on, for lack of a better term, like human creative activity, the types of things people create to enrich and to entertain and to illuminate something about the human condition.
Yeah.
But I think, again, like as information and entertainment and art, as those distinctions are no longer as relevant and as prominent as they used to be, I don't think that the distinction between pop culture literacy and media literacy is that important. I do align myself with pop culture literacy because, and this is maybe my small way of trying to uplift and highlight the idea that a lot of this content that we consume, I do think still has creativity and craft and humor and imagination and playfulness and delight. And it brings up some of those feelings that we always have as humans engaging with art, nostalgia and warmth and togetherness and kind of that feeling of new insight and new understanding. So I use pop culture literacy kind of to situate myself within that historical field that has been interested in human creative activity.
What is a pop culture text, and how objective is that definition?
It's definitely not objective. And I mean, if you ask someone like me, I'm going to say almost anything on earth is a pop culture text.
Mhm.
So I would say it's anything that's been created by humans or some group of humans, either directly or indirectly, meaning literally by humans or by AI using the previous creative work of humans that you can make meaning of, that you can, in a sense, read. So I would say, I'll start with like the most traditional kinds of pop culture text would be films, TV, music, video games, even I would put in the
Mhm.
traditional category. I would expand beyond that and say that any sort of content that we're encountering online is a pop culture text. So memes are pop culture text. Any sort of TikTok content, for example, is a pop culture text. And I would also expand it to include actual objects. I think fashion, merchandise, toys are all considered pop culture texts because these are all things that have been created by humans, directly or indirectly, that we can read and make meaning of.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to identify where things fit into pop culture because there certainly are many examples of whether it be books, TV shows, streaming, music, whatever, that are within the medium to be categorized as pop culture, right? They're not high culture. They can be accessed by a mass market, even if they are, not accessed by that many people, right? There's the super popular bestseller paperback book, YA novel or whatever, and then there's another one that not that many people have read and identifying. And I don't know where this is going, but I had this probably applies to more forms of media and more areas of pop culture than maybe almost all of them, but we all have our own relationship to what we're familiar with and communities that we're in. Like there's things like, for example, video games you
Mhm.
mentioned, that if I'm not mistaken, the video game industry is economically more significant than the film industry, right? There's more money there. And yet it's the type of thing that if you're not involved in it, you have almost no awareness of it. Like you know that video games are a
Right,
thing that exists, but you
right,
don't know what any of them are, right?
right.
And then for other people, obviously, it's something that they might
Yeah,
spend the majority of their available time on. I guess that's almost equally true of other things, but it was one that stood out to me when I was learning about maybe the magnitude of the industry and
yeah,
knowing that, you know what, I haven't known anything about what was happening with video games for 20 years,
right.
right? But I suppose it's the attempt to identify what the real world impacts are of pop culture. And
Yeah, and no, I mean, just on the topic of video games, which is really interesting to me, that was something I had to learn a lot about in writing the book. I mean, some of the things I wrote about are the things that have my heart that I know inside and out, and there's a particular insight one brings to pop culture when you are really engaged with it. And then when you're looking at something as an outsider, you probably notice things that the insiders don't even notice, right? And that might kind of intrigue and fascinate you in a way that they don't at least explicitly intrigue and fascinate an insider. But when I was studying video games and writing my book, I was becoming more and more aware of the way in which, even though I don't play video games,
mhm,
so many of the structures, frameworks, and lingo of video games have seeped into social media and seeped
mhm,
into just our everyday parlance. I think of something like NPC, non-player character. That's a term that I hear and that
sure.
I don't know if I've ever used it, but I know what it means, even though I haven't necessarily, played a video game since I was a child. So I think that's another feature of pop culture, the pop culture landscape today, which is that you don't even have to really deeply know things anymore to kind of ambiently know them and for them to be incorporated into your kind of framework for looking at the world.
Sure. Speaking of framework, so you have a pop culture literacy framework around active engagement, critical engagement, strategic engagement. Would you mind talking through that and those three pieces and what they're all about?
Sure. Yep. So these three categories, active, critical, and strategic, are meant to capture three different sets of skills and three different sets of habits that I think young people, if they develop them, they can make their engagement with pop culture in whatever form more positive and more productive and more intellectually rigorous. So the first one is active. So for me, what active engagement means is that, as it sounds like, you are not kind of passively consuming, whether it's content on your phone, a movie, a song. You are actively aware of the fact that you have selected this thing to engage with and that you are making meaning of it. We're all always making meaning of anything that we're engaging with, but it's often unconscious. And so active engagement is all about bringing that to a level of conscious awareness that I'm not totally passive consuming things on a phone. I am actually making choices and making sense of it. And it's going to have some sort of effect on the way that I'm thinking about myself or the world around me or others. So active engagement is really the foundation of the entire framework. Building on top of that, we've got critical engagement. So critical engagement really comes from the traditions of critical pedagogy and critical literacy. And critical engagement is about understanding the way that different systems of power are operating through the pop culture texts that we're engaging with. And that first means that we understand that whatever we're looking at is a crafted object, that some person or some group of people or some entity decided to create this thing and create it in a particular way and then circulate it in a particular way. And so instead of just naturalizing and normalizing it and just kind of letting it wash over us, we're really thinking about how did this show up in front of me and why did this show up in front of me and what intent is there to make me think or feel or do something in response to it. And then another idea of critical engagement is understanding that texts are, and this is getting a little bit theoretical, but texts are open systems. So that means that if you have, let's say, a meme, it doesn't just contain meaning and then convey it to people and then everybody takes in that same meaning. Texts organize meaning or facilitate meaning making processes. So we all make different meanings of the text that we encounter, and that's not a bug, it's a feature, right? Like that is a beautiful rich thing about engaging in any kind of literacy, that we all are making our own
Mhm.
meaning. And so another part of critical engagement is just having that awareness of what am I bringing to this text that's shaping the way that I'm understanding it and the way that I'm reacting to it. And then I think the last piece of that critical engagement pillar is that we recognize that sometimes we really love things and also they're problematic, right? There might
Yeah.
be some message that text is making possible. It might be a message that has some sort of stereotype embedded, for example, or it might be a text that is centering certain kinds of people and experiences and identities and marginalizing others. Like we might recognize the ways in which power is operating in that way, and yet we still have some sort of like attachment to it, or we're still drawn into it. And then that's okay. But we don't want to let our own sort of like warm attachments to something prevent us from doing that critical work of seeing how this text might have an impact on people and have a disproportionate impact on certain people who are more vulnerable. And then the last piece is the strategic engagement. And in my thinking about strategic engagement, I'm really building on what a lot of early childhood educators know about successful reading, which is that successful reading involves a lot of active self regulation. I'm using the term that Duke and Cartwright use in their active view of reading model. So active self-regulation is all about being able to organize your thinking and your reading processes and strategies in order to fulfill whatever your purpose is for reading. So just like we do that with print text as we're reading words on a page, we can do that with any kind of text that we are engaging in kind of the digital world or the pop culture landscape. So for me, strategic engagement requires that we understand how multimodal pop texts work. And that means that we understand that language is often used in pop culture texts, but also so are visual images, so are different layouts and formats, so are music and audio cues. So there's all these different modalities that are contributing to the meanings that these texts make available to us. And so being strategic means that we're understanding how we are reading and analyzing and interpreting all those different modalities as they work together. And then the last piece for strategic is intertextuality and getting that in this pop culture digital landscape, almost every text is intertextual in one way or another. That means it either refers specifically to another text. I'm thinking of like a Baby Yoda meme. So the meme is a text, but it's also referring to a different text, which is the TV show
Mhm.
Mandalorian. But oftentimes, text is intertextual in subtler ways than that, right? There are certain types of kind of formats and rhythms and tones that a text could take that's referring to other content and other pop culture texts. And you have to sort of be in the know to be able to detect that. So understanding the way that texts are referring to other texts is another way of strategically making sense of them for yourself.
What are the objectives in teaching culture literacy? Like what, I mean, there's the why, sure. Let's just say that it's a yes, let's do it. But what are the goals? What are you hoping that students will develop, like specifically by teaching pop culture literacy explicitly?
Yeah. I mean, I
For example, like I see, I mean, just the framework you talk through, and there's all those interconnections there to going back to media literacy too, right? But there's the piece of within the cultural text, within the media, within whatever the artifact is, developing literacy skills around what that thing is, what it means, the authority of the source, the themes that it's communicating, right? All those various pieces. There's also the context around it, I would imagine, how it fits into the larger world, the community of it, but also like knowing how would I share this or communicate about this to somebody who is not familiar with this piece, right? Or this culture. And but also knowing that, like understanding that it's a lens through which I engage with the world around me, but it is not the world in itself, right?
Yeah. I mean, even though you said objectives rather than the larger why, I feel like I can't answer the question without taking several steps back and
Okay.
talking about the larger why. So, taking those steps back, I would say that I start from the premise that the purpose of schooling is to help young people understand themselves as they
Mhm.
are, as they might be, as they could be, and understand the world as it is. And of course, kind of even beyond that, I want young people to have the sense of agency, have the skill set to navigate the world as it is, to make choices and take action and pursue goals, whether in the domain of kind of academic goals, professional goals, creative, civic. And so starting from that idea about what school is all about, I like John Dewey 100 years ago, I would say that I think schools really, especially American schools, lag behind where society is. Right? John Dewey was complaining about this 100 years ago, and I still think it's true. And there are times when I'm either in a classroom, a high school or middle school classroom, or I'm looking at some curriculum, maybe some box curriculum that teachers who are in my classes are using for their teaching. And I think this lesson could have been taught 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 50 years ago, exactly as it is. Right? It just doesn't reflect the world that we're currently living in. So for me, and what I value as an educator, I really want schools to better reflect society. And the world that we live in, right? And the world that we live in is absolutely saturated with these kinds of texts, right? We are absolutely drowning in these kinds of texts, and young people in particular. And so for me, the reason we do this, I'll narrow down into the objectives in just a moment, but the reason that we do this is because this is what's going to allow them to understand the world and to not just understand the world kind of once and for all today, but to
Hmm.
have these sort of durable skills and ways of thinking that they can kind of adapt and continue to develop as the world continues to change, right? As they continue to grow
Yeah.
older. So that's my bigger why. Now, when it comes to the actual objectives in this book, I've offered three different sets of lessons about pop culture literacy. And I can kind of talk through like the objectives of those sets of lessons because there are lessons that could be taught, but they're also just like ideas of lessons that could
Hmm.
be adapted in different contexts. So I would say when it comes to the first set of lessons, it's all about developing self-awareness and reflectiveness about what you're consuming, why, how, if it's working for you or not working for you, how it's having an effect on you. And then learning how to set goals around that, learning how to realize like I scroll on my phone for 3 hours before I go to bed every night. Is there a different thing that I might consume during that period of time that would be more productive for me to consume? Right.
Yeah.
So it's developing self awareness and that ability to reflect and set goals. The second set of lessons is about story, and it's about the latent narrative that we see in all sorts of texts, whether that's a traditional narrative text, like a film or an episode of a TV show, or a meme, or a video game, or like the stories that we hear our friends tell us, right? Like, and seeing how there are certain ideas about who we are and who other people are that get reinforced and solidified by engaging in cultural texts again and again. So the objective of those lessons is really about how we can detect the way that narrative works in all those different kinds of texts so that we can be in a position to critique and potentially resist messages that it might be sending about who we are and who others are. And then the third set of lessons is a set of lessons where students compose a literacy autoethnography. So that's just a fancy term for they're writing a personal narrative about their own relationship to a particular pop culture object. So it could be like a song they really love, or a video game, or a film, and they're putting themselves in relation to that object and that object in relation to the broader culture. So they're telling a story about themselves, but what they're really doing is examining the relationship between themselves, the culture, and that particular pop culture object that came from the culture. And so for me, the objective there is it really goes back to what I said about what I believe is the purpose of schooling or what it should be, which is to understand who we are and who we are in relation to the world that we are experiencing and moving around in. And so I think that being able to examine that relationship very closely is another objective of pop culture literacy. So these are very specific lessons, but again, I think those are kind of broader ideas that I would hope would show up in any sort of pop culture literacy curriculum. The idea of
Mhm.
self-awareness, reflection, and goal setting, the ability to identify latent narrative in different kinds of texts, and then that ability to examine the relationship between self and culture and a pop culture object.
How critical is a classroom discussion in, a pop culture literacy lesson? I mean, I would imagine that there's a significant amount of value to be gained from hearing peers discuss pieces of pop culture that they've evaluated that are meaningful to them, hearing about things that I didn't know anything about, but now I'm like broadening my horizons and vice versa. I am thinking about it.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about it again related to like what makes it sometimes so challenging, like the relationships with media literacy. You would see the same thing happen in pop culture literacy, where we're all exposed to different things. A lot of
Mhm.
it is by choice and
Mhm.
self-selection,
Mhm.
and sometimes if it's meant for entertainment, I like this type of music or that type, or I don't like music at all, or whatever,
Right.
right? There's no stakes necessarily to that other than one's own enrichment and enjoyment. And then there's other things happening that certainly matter, and a lot of the same critical thinking abilities, critical engagement, strategic engagement would apply. But I can think about how challenging it is to even begin a conversation with somebody for whom I know like we're not engaging with the same information or the same sources of information. If I have one place, maybe
Yeah.
I have a social media feed where I curate, my diet of media sources, and then I use that as a way to keep up with
Hmm.
what's happening. And then I'm trying to have a conversation or a debate on the merits of something with somebody who consumes completely different information, right? Then it's like I don't even where do I even begin? Because I
Right.
like the thing that would be the easy starting point is this thing happened. I think it's bad. What do you think and
Right.
why,
Right.
right? That you can't even get that far. The same thing like applies with pop culture where there's things that you want to be able to discuss, but you're maybe talking about it to a
Mhm.
friend, a peer, a teacher who isn't starting with an awareness. If you want to talk about social media memes, I feel like a great example of it is sports ball, right? Like some people want to talk about what's happening with sports, and then people who don't care about it kind of diminish
Mhm.
it as, oh, they're talking about sports ball. And
Yeah.
it's like, well, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like we can't just talk about what we like, what we don't like, what happened. Somebody
Yeah.
is going to come at it from an angle of, well, this is trivial, but
Yeah.
these things are meaningful, right? It means a lot to people. It's part of how they think of themselves as people, how they develop their identities for young people, the communities, the affinity groups they're a part of, the media they
Yeah.
consume, what they like to read, etc. So anyway, that goes all the way back to the question a long time ago, is the
Discuss.
role that discussion can play in that and how that is helpful to students in learning how to communicate things, and the challenge of saying, okay, I need to be able to describe this and analyze it for an audience who isn't starting from a point of knowing this
Right.
as well as I do, but also
Right.
it's opening me up to hearing what others are discussing, and perhaps having a much better perspective on everybody that's around me.
Yeah. I, discussion is incredibly important, as it is in any literacy endeavor. I would say that what you're describing is indeed a challenge of pop culture literacy in that like it's really hard to choose text because there's no way that you can choose a text that is going to be equally intriguing to every person in your classroom. And this is really the kind of thing where like you really cannot just rinse and repeat year after year because the texts are going to change. So it is hard to select shared text, but what I try to be really clear about is like what's the purpose of the discussion that I want to have,
Hmm.
and is a shared text required to fulfill that purpose? So the way I think about it is that there's sort of two main reasons you would want to gather everybody around one shared text and discuss it. One would be is if you're introducing a concept, right? If you're introducing a concept or a strategy or some way of thinking about a text, you're going to want everybody to be looking at the same text, and you're going to want to be able to model it based on the text. You're going to want to have people practice on that text. And so you do need a shared text for that purpose. For me, when I teach lessons like this, especially if I'm leading the instruction on that particular day, I'm going to choose something that I am personally interested in, and it's not going to matter as much to me if students are super familiar with it, because I want to teach about it in a way that's going to show and highlight the transferable concept or strategy, right? It's not really
Hmm.
about the text, it's about that higher level idea that they can transfer to their own work. The other reason that you'd really want to share text, particularly in discussion, is when you sort of want to hash out the meaning of something, right? And you want to have that debate of like, this is problematic, this is not problematic, or this means this, or this means that.
Yeah.
And those can be really fun and juicy and rich conversations to have. And what I've found helpful to structure those kinds of conversations when I want to have them is to build up a particular kind of text that we use over time, knowing that on the first day that we're doing that kind of discussion, there will be some segment of the class that hasn't actually engaged with that text. So, for example, this summer I was teaching a group of extraordinary young people, rising high school seniors, And I asked them on the first day of class, like, what are some pop culture things that you're looking at? And there was all sorts, it was like Squid Games, there was a lot of Love Island, of course, and even like older things in my mind, like Kardashians. But we went with Love Island, and maybe only half of my students were really engaged with Love Island on day one of me using a Love Island example. But then by day five, by day seven, they were sort of enough into it where everybody could meaningfully have a position to take on whatever it was that we were looking at. But I would also want to suggest that I think that we don't always need to be looking at the same text to have a productive discussion about pop culture. I think the way that ELA standards are written, the way that ELA is often taught, is very focused on sort of making an argument and supporting that argument with text evidence, right? You are kind of vying for the most correct interpretation of the text. So you're saying this text means this, and I'm going to point to this and this, and that's what tells me it means that. But I would suggest, and I think this is true of pop culture literacy, I also think it's true of academic literacy more traditionally. I think we need to have more discussions where instead of making an argument about a text, we are tracing back where our own perceptions and interpretations come from. And we're doing
Mhm.
that reflective work of saying, the reason why I'm focusing on this part of the text is because this character is one who like I feel very connected to. Or the reason why like I didn't even notice that little bit of humor is because I actually didn't know what it was referencing. So
Mhm.
having a discussion where you're negotiating meaning of a text, but not necessarily vying for the most correct interpretation, but you are tracing back, unpacking what it is that you brought to the text that shaped your understanding of it. And I think that's a really productive kind of discussion to have about, as I said, any kind of text that doesn't necessarily require shared text. The last point I would make about discussion that I think, regardless of the kind of discussion you're having, the reason why it's important is if we're saying that texts are open systems and that we all have different interpretations of a text, that's really easy to agree with in theory or to kind of understand that in a really general sense. But you're not going to really understand that in your bones until you hear four different understandings of a text that come from four different places. Once you experience, that's going to give you a much deeper understanding of that concept. And I think that concept is so key to being a critical reader of any text.
Does an educator introduce pop culture literacy to students and the fact that this is something we're going to study and then, encourage these different types of engagement, thinking like particularly the critical engagement, but all of them in a way that has the intended effect of making them feel like they're being valued, right? The things that they like and engage with in their daily lives are being valued by being brought into the school and saying, we should study this because this is what your life is, right? And these are things that you're engaging with in day to day. And that's why we're elevating it to this environment, right? I guess versus like maybe if it's approached the wrong way, or at the very least, if a student perceives it the wrong way, it could almost, you know, feel the opposite, like
Mhm.
being forced to critically engage
Yeah,
with something that they love and you're ruining it or whatever,
for
right?
sure.
And
Yeah.
like
No.
so how do you start that and yeah, I guess sustain it to make sure that it is really enriching and deepening understanding and their relationship to their world and not having them feel like now this is just becoming schoolwork.
Yeah, no, it's so true. We in one of my classes at Hunter College, we read an excerpt of Hua Shu's memoir, and we read about his it's kind of his own pop culture autoethnography where he's talking about how much he loves Nirvana when he was a kid and how he created zines based on Nirvana. And we, as teachers, we all are reading this and we're like, oh, that's so cool. Like there was so much critical engagement there and it was so
Mhm.
strategic and it was so creative and imaginative. He was creating these zines. Why don't we do more things like that in school? We get kind of excited about that idea. And then we think, okay, so then what would that look like in school? And then it's almost like it just clicks for everybody. We're like, oh my gosh, he would have hated that. He would have hated if
Mhm.
we took that thing that he was doing in this kind of private space that he'd created for himself and we made it part of the official curriculum and we made it something that was going to be evaluated. My answer to the question of how like not to ruin things is to have really explicit conversations with students about that possibility of things being ruined, right? So if you were going to bring something in, if you're going to, whether it's a TV show or a song or something like that, you can talk to them about like, what are the things we might bring in? Here's what we're going to have to do with them. We're going to have to like discuss them in this particular structure. You're going to have to write about them in this particular way. You know, you actually just lay out, here are the things we're going to do. What are the things you're willing to share in this space? And let them take the lead on that and identify what those things are and, and recognize that like there's probably music that they're piping into their ears that's like so personal that they don't really care to break down the lyrics and decide if they're misogynistic, right? They just want to have that personal experience. So I'd say really open and explicit conversations about what these texts are. And I don't want to say that what the texts are don't matter, but I do want to say that they don't matter as much as that you're teaching skills and habits of mind. And those skills and habits of mind can be taught on any text. And so if a student does not want to bring in their most personal text that they're attached to and subject it to scrutiny and inquiry and discussion and written analysis, that's totally fine. I wanted to also, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Oh, I wanted to also say that I think that teaching pop culture literacy is fun and engaging. And I think pop culture literacy certainly helps students feel, you know, more centered and valued because things that they care about are
Hmm.
being brought into the classroom. But also recognize that I don't think of this kind of work as just that sort of like hook into the academic world.
Hmm.
And even though I say that, I find myself when I'm teaching pop culture literacy, I still sometimes sort of treat it that way. And so I always, to your question about how we introduce it to students, I always want to introduce it as serious intellectual inquiry and inquiry that's going to help us understand ourselves and understand the world more deeply. And it's going to help us and serve us in the pursuit of whatever goals we have on a personal or academic or professional level, right? So I want to make sure that students recognize that this is like the serious work of serious people and not
Hmm.
just like a fun little appetizer we're doing before we get to the main course. This summer, in this course that I taught to high school students, we were just as an example, it's not particularly connected to my book. We were learning about different literary theories and using literary theories as a lens to analyze a text. And we did postmodernism, post-structuralism, critical race theory, feminism, and others. And on each of those, for each of those literary theories, we applied it to some sort of pop culture text, and we also applied it to a more traditional literary text. So take post-colonialism, for example. We watched some clips from The Lion King, the original Lion King, which by the way, they all know and love and see on TikTok all the time. So nothing is old anymore. Everything old is new again. But we watched some clips from The Lion King and we're applying a post-colonial lens to those clips. And then we read a poem by Ocean Vuong, Amazon History of a Former Nail Salon Worker, and we applied a post-colonial lens. And then we read Blood Child, Octavia Butler, and applied a post-colonial lens. And I'm not convinced that applying that post-colonial lens is more complex or rigorous or challenging when applied to a literary text than it is when applied to The Lion King, right?
Hmm.
It is as rigorous as you make it. And so I always want to send that message to them too. It's like we're not just practicing on The Lion King so that we can do this in these literary texts. It's that all of this work that we're doing on any text applying this lens is going to be helpful for us in understanding how colonialism and imperialism work in this world. And so I try to send that message that there's this, you know, no two texts are the same. It's not the same experience, but there's an equality in terms of the value of that intellectual experience, whether you're applying a new skill to a movie or a short story or a novel.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I assume there's an understanding that can be reached that only things of some substance are worthy of that type of criticism, right? I mean, there's quite a bit
Yeah.
of scholarship around film criticism, music, etc., and these are all pop culture, and nobody at this point in time thinks of that as frivolous, unworthy of that, and but
Right.
and
And
getting
yet,
students to,
I think a lot of the pop culture texts that I teach with, I think of as worthy and I think of as having a craft to them that's worth dissecting in the same way it's worth dissecting in a piece of literature, a canonical piece of literature. And yet I also think that idea that only something that has artistic merit is worth examining closely is another kind of old-fashioned idea that,
Hmm.
even though like consciously, I don't know if many people would advocate for that, but I think that there's the residue of that idea in a lot of our curriculum and our teaching, right? That
Hmm.
there's this assumption that when we're talking about a text in a set of ELA standards, we are imagining a long-standing text, a significant canonical text that we have agreed has some sort of literary or artistic merit. And I do think that those are not the only kinds of texts that are worth closely examining.
Well, we don't know if it has artistic merit until we
Right.
examine it. So,
Yeah.
what is the state of pop culture literacy among today's students? And what do you find them to
Hmm.
be more literate than people may assume in these areas? How is it?
I think so. And yet I'm inclined to think so because when I talk to young people and when I teach with young people, I'm looking for those strengths and assets and abilities
Mhm.
that already exist in them, right? So I do tend to take a somewhat rosy, maybe too rosy view of the current state. But what I see and what I hear when I talk to the young people I teach is that first, they're much savvier than I think they are depicted in the mainstream discourse about how content works, how it's circulated, why it shows up in front of them, why it's structured in the way it is. They're very savvy about intertextuality. In the little corners of the internet that they occupy, they understand what they are consuming and they understand what makes it funny or what makes it interesting. They understand too why certain content creators do what they do in order to get more engagement, to get more likes and clicks and comments. Like they're pretty savvy about that. And I think that to me is not that surprising. What I find, I wouldn't say surprising, but what I find really heartening is that I think that the young people today have more taste than they're given credit for having. A lot of what they encounter in the digital world is garbage. I mean, it's literally slop, it's brain rot. And these are also, by the way, words that young people created to describe what they're seeing. And there's also stuff that's great and funny and creative and playful and imaginative. They know the difference. Not to say that those
Mhm.
are universal categories that we all agree on, but they know what they like and they know what they don't like and they know how to get more of what they like and reduce what they don't like. And, when asked, when we have these conversations, they can articulate what it is they like and why they like it. And I think that aspect is key. And I think that's like the little seedling of what I want to teach in my book. That seedling of, I know what I'm engaging with here, and I have an opinion about it or a feeling about it. That's what I would want to build on in what I'm suggesting we teach in this book.
What should teachers be learning from their students?
I've personally learned a lot about how to manipulate my algorithm from listening to young people. I mean, I've learned technical things from my students. I also, I mean, this was a couple of years ago, but I didn't know until a student told me that when you put your thumb on the right side of the screen on TikTok and now on Instagram, it speeds up the video. It's like where your thumb naturally rests, right? And what my students were telling me about that was how it makes the world feel like it's going too slow. And like when someone's talking, you want to like
Hmm.
put your thumb on the screen and make them talk faster. Like we understand these broad brushstrokes of, oh, their attention span is shot and they're so easily distracted. But when you hear more of the details of what they're actually encountering, especially in terms of the functionality of these apps and how the apps are designed to be addictive and how they're designed to give you that kind of quick hit of warm feelings, they know so much more about that, and they know, and that's a dynamic situation. These apps are always being updated, right? And so I think that talking to them about what that actual experience is like on their phones in some granularity is really helpful in contextualizing what it is we're seeing if we're standing up in front of them in a classroom and we're teaching. And I also think that once given that little nudge to be critical or to be strategic, to interpret and respond to the texts that they're consuming, I think we can learn even more strategies for engagement, right? Like I'm suggesting certain strategies for engagement that I think are somewhat durable, that I think are going to last for some time in the future, but they should also be self-extending, right? So once we give them that little nudge and we kind of teach them some ways of thinking about what they're consuming, they're going to build on those and they're going to be able to identify strategies that are updating to reflect the dynamic nature of pop culture in the digital world. So I think that's another thing that we should be listening to young people about and learning from them.
Yeah. I don't know if this is off topic, but you're reminding me. I was listening to a podcast a couple of days ago, and the guest also has a show, and the host was saying, "Man, I'm used to listening to your podcast, and I listen at 1.5 speed, and now I'm sitting here talking to you, and it feels like you're talking too slow." So
Right.
to the point of the TikTok, it can be disorienting. It really does change your exposure to the world.
Yeah.
Mia, let's close with this. When you think about pop culture literacy and, young people today, older people today, all ages, what worries you and what are you inspired by?
I'll start by what I'm inspired by, because I think it connects to what I was just speaking about. I'm inspired by the savvy and creativity and
Mm,
ingenuity of young people, both in the ways they're engaging, but also in the ways that they are creating pop culture texts. The actual content that I consumed in researching this book, content created by teens, I found to be especially delightful and showed just how much richness they're bringing to their engagement and was often delighted by their creations. So I'm inspired by that. I'm inspired by that potential. What worries me is the space for this in schools.
mm,
What I would say is, I think one meaningful counter argument to teaching pop culture literacy is that we need kids reading and writing print text words, right? We need their, just in terms of reading, like we need their eyes on text. We need them to be practicing reading fluently and constructing meaning from text. And I agree with that. And I think that kids need to be reading way more books in schools, like whole books, right? Rather than short passages and excerpts of longer works. I'm worried that what threatens that, though, to me, in my view, is the kinds of boxed curricula that are being approved and vetted and put out that almost contentify literature and make it
mm.
smaller and more bite-sized and are not giving students those opportunities to engage with longer texts. So I'm concerned about that. But I don't think that incorporating pop culture literacy is like the threat to that. Because I think in whatever way that we're teaching pop culture literacy or anything in ELA or in the humanities, there needs to be lots and lots of reading and writing happening. And there can be with pop culture literacy as well. I'm just worried that we are kind of crowding out these meaningful opportunities to engage with texts that our students are encountering,
Yeah.
and what's crowding them out are these kind of shorter, less meaningful distortions of literary texts that really stand no chance of actually engaging or enriching students.
Excellent. Well, listeners, you can find the book Pop Culture Literacies from Routledge or wherever you get your books. We'll put the link below in the show notes. Mia, where can listeners learn more? Would you like to tell them about your newsletter?
I write a newsletter about pop culture literacies, applying the concepts from my book to new examples. The newsletter can be found on Substack. It's called Popstack. And you can find me on Instagram as well at Mia Elizabeth Hood.
Excellent. Well, we will put those links in the notes below. Check out Popstack, check out the book, and if you have not already, please do also subscribe, rate the podcast. We always appreciate those ratings. It really does help new listeners find the show. So please do all of the above. We'll put that all below for you to make it easy for you. Mia, thanks again for being here.
Thank you so much.
This episode was edited by Gage Sanderson.